You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Well, welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. If you want further information about the program, you can leave messages on 0439 395 489. You can email us on info@anarchistage@yahoo.com or Pipsy or info@pipsy.net. YouTube channels, public interest before corporate interests, josephtoscano.nam, Facebook pages, Joseph Toscano, you name it, we've got it. That very overrated social media. So, unfortunately, I'm not an internet warrior. I've usually got my feet on the ground. Physically, maybe not intellectually, but physically. Now, what I'd like to do this morning is join the dots in the land of milk and honey. You know, I've been on the planet over 7 decades, and I'm getting sick and tired of the same crap. Week after week, week after week. And seeing solutions which are obvious to even an idiot like me, and possibly to people like you, who are not idiots, obviously, but don't seem to be available to very few in the community, because we've all seemed to have been incorporated in one way or another in the private investment for private profit mentality which rules the roost in Australia in 2024. Now, I keep saying this every week, but I'm just going to try to expand on it today, because I think it's important that we as a people understand what's going on around us. I know there's a lot of identity politics about, and there's things that are happening overseas which are grotesque, which we'll speak about. But the fact is that we really need to understand what's happening in our own country in order to do something about it. You know, I'm sick and tired of stories about homelessness, stories about increasing rents, stories about people not being able to buy a home, stories about people being diddled at work, stories, you know, about all these charities which have been established in this country, over 32,000, to look after the needs which government is not able to access. And I'm sick and tired of stories about crumbling public hospitals, ambulance systems which are overwhelmed, public education sector which is grossly underfunded. And I'm sick and tired of hearing about all the issues which occur as a result of all this. Sick and tired of it. You may not be sick and tired of it, but when you see it week after week after week after week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, you got to ask yourself, do we have the political, social, cultural mentality to actually address this issue? We're one of the most fortunate little group of people on the planet, not just in 2024, but since Cro-Magnon man and woman, wandered out of Africa, was it over 100,000 years ago? We have 27, possibly, maybe 26.8, around 27 million people living in this country. Now, this is a huge country. It's a continent. There are 5 continents on planet Earth, and we're on one of these continents, and there are 27 million people of us living on this continent. I mean, as I keep saying, this isn't Bangladesh, all right? It's not even Bhutan. It's 27 million people living in this country, and we've got all these issues which dominate conversation, well, maybe not conversation in the House, but dominate political and social discourse. And things seem to be getting worse but not better. So why is it so, said Professor Julius Sumner Miller, those of you who are old enough to remember the old professor. So what we need to do is join the dots. Now, we live on a continent which is called Australia, with some surrounding islands, okay? Now, people lived on this continent and in the Torres Strait for over 60,000 years. They had their little groups. I think there are about 250, 260 independent nation states on the continent, and they went about their merry way, living the lives they wanted to live. Now, the usual human conflicts which occur in any society. And then in 1788, the British Empire decided to set up a convict settlement at Port Jackson in New South Wales. And over the next 150 years, we did an exceptionally good job, a really good job of eradicating as many First Nations people as we could. We wanted their land, we wanted their resources. And the idea of the land of milk and honey, the old biblical term, manna in the land of milk and honey, began to take hold in this country. And we had people who over decades were able to change the direction of this country from a brutal convict settlement which depended on the forceful takeover of land and the extermination of this country's First Nations people, right? And we said to ourselves, we are going to create a new society. A society which is based on possibly egalitarian principles, because there's enough for everyone. Now, obviously, this was a dream. Because every little thing you enjoy today, whether it's universal health care, whether it's a social security system, not a welfare system, but a social security system, whether it's public education, whether it's public transport, public infrastructure, whether it's parliamentary democracy, every little thing was won by struggle. Sometimes violent, sometimes peaceful. But struggle was necessary in order to try to redistribute the land and the resources which had been forcefully taken over by people who were called squatters, not 2024 squatters, people looking for empty houses to keep a roof over their head, but squatters who squatted the land And with Victoria, which I'm familiar with, and I'm sure it's similar across Australia, 700 squatters owned, OWNED, all of Victoria, within 30 years of colonisation process beginning in 1835-36 in Victoria. Now, we have been through a tough time, all right? We had COVID-19, and then now we've got we've got to pay back the bill, okay? So people are doing it tough. Isn't that a lovely word? Doing it tough. Now, why are 27 million people living on a continent doing it tough in 2024? Why do you have these continuing stories about how difficult it is for an increasing number of people living on this continent? So you've got to go back a few steps. And we've got to go back to the ideas which led to the occupation of Australia. And that ideas was based on a private investment for private profit model. And we as a people have accepted that premise. We've accepted that capitalism, that's private investment for private profit, is the only logical, legitimate, moral, ethical way to run a society. And that somehow, if we leave everything to the private marketplace, the market, in inverted commas, this soulless entity, the market will somehow create and distribute wealth. Well, obviously nothing is as ridiculous as this particular statement. I mean, the 17th and 16th and the 18th century were about the market, and the 19th century about the market doing its gig without state intervention. And obviously we saw the brutalities, the inequalities, the starvation of that particular period. So here we are in 2024, devotees not to some type of religious belief or philosophical statement, but devotees to Mammon. That's right. Devotees to the temple priests. Devotees to the dollar. Most of us wage slaves trying to keep body and soul together by sacrificing our lives in order to get enough to survive, or even prosper and occasionally have a lovely little holiday. So why do we find ourselves in this situation in 2024? Why do we find ourselves in this situation in the land of milk and honey? And it's obvious. We do not own the resources of this country. This is an incredibly rich resource country. We make lots of our money by exporting agricultural resources and by exporting natural resources, whether it be timber, coal, gold, diamonds, uranium, you name it, bauxite, we've got it. But there's a problem, a fundamental problem. Resource extraction is not dominated by the state, but resource extraction is not dominated by collectives or cooperatives. Resource extraction is dominated by billionaires and transnational corporations which are making a killing. A killing. Although they only employ about 2.5% of the population, making a killing. Just look at the latest share market price of most of these corporations, whether it's Rio Tinto, whether it's BHP Billiton, and the list goes on and on, you will see that those shareholders are really having a good time. Now, obviously, you think because you've got superannuation, I don't think this shit, and that your superannuation is invested in the stock market, that somehow your future is intertwined with their future. And that's what they got us thinking. I'm not saying you think it personally, but that's how they got us thinking, all right? So sometimes I think I'm an incredibly idiotic, stupid, ignorant human being, all right? Now, instead of us as a people extracting these resources through public enterprises and exporting them and using the profits that were made to deal with the issues we face every day, because there's not enough finance, governments keep telling us, well, then maybe we would be living in the land of milk and honey. We wouldn't have the growing inequalities which we see in our society. We wouldn't have young people being robbed of a future in this country. We wouldn't have elderly people without superannuation facing homelessness and despair. And maybe we'd have a little bit more personal security, less anxiety, less reactive depressive illnesses due to the situation we find ourselves in. So to me, it's logical. It is logical. If the resources that are under the ground belong to the Crown, in inverted commas, us, why should we allow private corporations to make extraordinary profits, all right, and pay peppercorn minuscule tax and peppercorn royalties? Now, if we need these corporations to, exploit the resources, why don't we make a little bargain like 80% of profits go into the public treasury, federal treasury, 20% of the profits go into your shareholders' pockets and your CEO's pockets? But no, all the debate is about how we distribute a limited basket of resources to an increasing population. And so we have all these, minuscule debates about immigration, causing increasing rents. So why do we have immigration causing increasing rents? Because there's no resources to build public housing. I mean, some European countries, 40 or 50% of people live in public housing, and they live in the same public house, intergenerational. Extraordinary. So it's really a matter of thinking. And then on top of that, we had the privatisation virus. Worse than COVID-19. At least all COVID-19 did was kill people. But the privatisation virus has actually destroyed the conveyor belt to the Australian Treasury. I mean, we had many profitable, publicly owned institutions where the profits went to the Treasury at the end of the year, not to the shareholders. And you see, if you want to look at these things in a capitalist framework, if we're citizens and permanent residents in this country, we are the shareholders. And the government of the day should be able to distribute enough funds, because of all the resources we have, because we're in the land of milk and honey, to think of every basic human need, and also even pay for a universal basic income. I mean, it's so logical, isn't it? That's why it doesn't make any sense. Obviously, in 2024, where facts are irrelevant, where the media has been colonised by the corporate sector, where, we think that the virtual world is the real world, obviously it's becoming more and more difficult for an increasing number of people to join the dots and actually look at the reason they find themselves in this particular situation. As I said before, radical problems require radical solutions. Now listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. You know, it's particularly, as I said, I'm shaking my head. You can't see it. Luckily you can't see it because, you'd go dizzy watching me shaking my head today. Remember the old 1880s, 1890 workers, struggle? 8 hours work, 8 hours play, 8 hours sleep. Seemed decent enough, didn't it? Let's have an 8-hour working day. Initially it was a 6-day week. But guess what? Last week we had some legislation passed through Parliament. Could have even been this week. Guess what? The right to disconnect. I mean, nothing's new, isn't it? The right to disconnect. In the good old days, during the Industrial Revolution in Mother England, for those of you who come from Mother England, people would sleep at the workshop. They wouldn't actually worry about needing accommodation. They sleep in between the machines, copulate in between the machines. They were there at the beck and call of their masters 24 hours a day. Well, with the virtual digital revolution, we saw the same thing happen. But the difference was that instead of your employer providing you with accommodation and food and a little bit of area to copulate, what happens? You're there constantly. Beep, beep, beep. Yes, Your Highness. Oh, look, have you looked at the figures for today? I'm not happy with the figures for today. Beep, 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 beep. Oops, beep, another email. Oh no, really? You want me to come into work? I'm at my kid's 5th birthday party. No, work's more important, mate. Could you come in and don't forget you don't get paid. Now, there's all this bullshit from employers about the right to disconnect is going to bankrupt the nation. You've got to listen to them to really think, do they really believe this shit? I'm sure they've got the right to disconnect, all right? Now, in the good old days, that's the bad old days, we turn the good old days these days, if you were on call, you got paid for being on call. So if your employer wanted you to work more than 40 hours a week, you got paid overtime. And if your employer needed to contact you because you're in an essential service and you may be called back to work, you got an allowance, an on-call allowance, which is reasonable. But in the virtual world, you need to be there at their beck and call 24 hours a day. 2 a.m, beep. Oh, did you look at those figures? What figures? The ones you stuffed up last week. I want you to sort it out now. Get out of bed and do your work. I know that's an extreme example. So the right to disconnect is nothing new. I mean, if you're a wage slave, which most have been or are, the fact is, even if you're self-employed, you're a wage slave, the fact is that right to disconnect, especially if you're working for somebody else, is a fundamental right which we've had since the creation of the 8-hour day. So what's so radical about having that right to live a life outside work commitments? And if they want you, to put in outside work commitments, they should pay up. Simple. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. And as I speak, the Pacific Island Forum is on in Tonga. And our beloved Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, is going to the Pacific Island Forum. But, see, these Pacific Islanders, Tonga, Solomon Islands, Fiji, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, The list goes on and on. You know, all these little Cook Islands, they're all worried. Torres Strait in northern Australia, they're all worried. They're all worried about the climate emergency. They're concerned that as we in the world, the Western world, and now increasingly the Asian world, put up more shit into the atmosphere, increased carbon CO2 levels, that sea levels will rise as the ice melts. And if sea level rises, which it is doing as I speak, their countries will disappear. Now, obviously, they're a little bit concerned because their real estate values will be nil. Nobody wants to buy a patch of water. So you would think that Mr Albanese, on behalf of the Australian people, as the Prime Minister of this country, would be going to Tonga to reassure people that Australia's doing the, is going to do something regarding, opening more coal mines, opening up more gas reserves. But obviously this is not on the agenda because this is what we're doing. Although we are moving forward to a renewable energy type of situation, unless me mate Peter gets into power, which is always a strong possibility. Because, if hate speech, you can get a long way. I mean, I could give you a bit of hate speech today, and I'm sure that, I'd become a celebrity. But I can't be bothered because I don't hate anybody. Well, yet. But getting back to this Pacific Island Forum. So what is Mr Albanese taking on behalf of the Australian people to the Pacific Island Forum, where the United Nations Deputy General, whatever he was called, was there saying climate change is the biggest threat to the world and especially to the Pacific Islands? Well, he's got an idea for a new regional police force. That's right. Because we're concerned that these people are going to get angry. They're going to rebel. They're going to throw out their governments, which, pay lip service to addressing the climate emergency. That the Chinese in the Solomon Islands are assisting the Solomon Island police force to maintain order. So he's brought that little idea to the Pacific Island Forum. So let's see what happens, what the independent Pacific Island sovereign nation states, irrespective of how little they are, think of this wonderful progressive idea, which has been brought to them on behalf of, some foreign power. And we're foreign powers to them. Let's see what happens. There is no middle ground. See, Mr Albanese and the current Labor government, look, I'm not going to be mean to them. They're faced with a triple threat. There's the threat of the fear campaign that Mr Dutton is now pursuing, which they now acknowledge publicly. There is the threat of a corporate-owned media which is hell-bent on seeing Mr Dutton and the Liberal National Party back in power. And there is the threat of the Green Party actually securing more parliamentary representation because of they continue to stand by their principles. So Mr Albanese's, was frightened into action regarding the CMFEU putting it into administration because of some allegations which appeared in the corporate-owned media. The Albanese-led Labor government has been frightened to say boo regarding the carnage, and that's the only word you can use. You can't use the word war. The carnage, the daily carnage, which is occurring in Gaza. Mr Albanese and the Labor government are very concerned about the fact that people are doing it tough, irrespective of their legislative agenda and the way this has been exploited by forces in this country, which will make things much, much, much tougher than they are, although the corporate-owned media, and to a lesser extent, the colonised ABC, and I'll explain what I mean by that later on, are beating the drum of the fact that we need some type of middle ground. There is no middle ground in Australia today. There is no middle ground. You stand by your principles or you fall because you are not willing to apply those principles. And that's the difference of every Labor government since the Whitlam-led Labor government, which as soon as it was elected, passed a host of reforms irrespective of the corporate-owned media response at that particular point in time. So there is no middle ground in Australian politics, in Australian economic direction. You either support a private investment for private profit mantra, you support state intervention in terms of trying to remedy the worst excesses of a private investment for private profit mantra, or you look at something else. You look at a different way. You look at nationalising this country's major resource assets without compensation. Or, if you're concerned about the constitutional arrangements, which says you need to compensate people, well, what you do is you say, look, sorry, boys, and girls, there are a lot of girls these days in it too, sorry, we've just passed legislation through Parliament that 80% of your profits will now go to the Treasury. And if you don't like it, piss off and we'll take over when you leave. Very simple. All right, let's move on. So there is no middle ground. And if the Albanese Labor government continues to follow this inane, stupid line where it tries to placate the small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and placate institutional power brokers in this country, then they face, as we saw in the Northern Territory, they face political oblivion. You listen to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This is The Anarchist World This Week. You can podcast the program by going to 3cr.org.au. My name's Joseph Toscano. Well, ever heard of state-sponsored environmental terrorism? It's a wonderful thing, environmental terrorism. And I'm not talking about the environmental terrorism we see every day, of the climate emergency. I mean, that's state-sponsored environmental terrorism. But I'm talking about, opening up dams. Now, you see, the people of Bangladesh were pissed off with the little dictator they had in power, electorally elected dictator, right? Tens of thousands were in prison, people were disappearing, the economic situation was going backwards. They revolted in a mass uprising a few weeks ago, and the Prime Minister fled to India, who had been the main sponsor of that particular Bangladeshi government. Okay? Now, interestingly, the rebels, the student radicals, didn't want the opposition to be in power. What's happened, they've appointed an interim Prime Minister who's a respected Nobel laureate because of the work he did promoting microfinance to assist people out of poverty in that particular country. So he was, although he's public enemy number one under the previous government, he's now the interim Prime Minister. So what did the Indian government do? Well, I've got to be fair, they've denied it point blank. It's a little bit like the Israeli Defence Force. You deny it point blank. They opened the gates on the dams to flood northern Bangladesh as punishment for what they'd done. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but many Bangladeshi believe this is an example of India saying to them, don't go too far in your reform agenda. Don't go too far, because there will be consequences. It's not like the jets which are used by the Israeli Defence Forces. It's not like the missiles that have been used by the Russian forces. This is a particularly brilliant form of terrorism. This is environmental terrorism. Although we saw a bit of this, and we continue to see it in Gaza, where you kind of restrict the food and water supply to a population, to keep them quiet. So have a look around the world, see what's happening, and join the dots, because that's the key, is to join the dots. Right, Northern Territory, Don Dale Mark II. Remember the disaster regarding the Don Dale Youth Detention Centre and all those horrific accounts, pictures, royal commissions, the list goes on and on. Now, it's fascinating that for the last year there have been extensive reporting in the virtual media as well as the legacy media regarding the law and order situation in the Northern Territory. And I've just had an election where there's been a total change of government. Now, a few little facts. The agenda put forward by both the Labor Party and the CLB, the Country Liberal Party, as far as law and order was concerned, was very familiar. It's the type of agenda which has been used since colonisation began. Oh, sorry, they forgot the killings, all right? Let's not deal with that. All right, no, we don't shoot people anymore. En masse, maybe occasionally. But, so Don Dale Mark II, okay? More prisons, harsher bail laws, decrease the age of criminal responsibility to 10. Any of you got any 10-year-old kids? Think about it. Criminal justice system, send them off, put them in somewhere, turn the key, forget about them. Now, interestingly, 45% of electors outside the metropolitan regions in the Northern Territory voted. 55% are so disillusioned with the inability of government to solve any issues, they didn't even bother to turn up to cast a ballot, although, it's a compulsory. So we saw this influx of people who basically, live in the Territory, there to make a buck like the rest of us. Well, not in the Territory in my case. Come to say, well, we need a bit of stronger law and order. We need more jails. We need harsher sentences. We need harsher bail laws. And we need to decrease the age of criminal responsibility to 10. That's the only way to solve the law and order problem. Now, interestingly, the Greens in the Northern Territory made some gains in terms of the number of people voting for them, especially in metropolitan areas. Not enough to claim seats, although they may have possibly won one. But they said, look, a lot of this shit is due to the fact of the way we interact and treat First Nations people in the Northern Territory. Because, 95, maybe 99% of youth detainees are Indigenous. And only, I think it's about 36% of the population of the Northern Territory are Indigenous. And about 90% of all prisoners in Northern Territory prisons are also Indigenous. And as you know, we've got one of the highest incarceration rates of any group of people on planet Earth. That's because we live in the land of milk and honey, let's not forget that. Milk for some, honey for others, and nothing for others. So, what happens in the Northern Territory? Well, we'll be seeing fracking, gas extraction, a bit more cheap labour, more prisons, more prison officers, more police. But will it solve any of the social issues or the law and order issues which are such a concern for so many Territorians? Well, it's been tried before and it's failed. Even in the US of A, the land of prisons, the land of privatised prisons, they've realised that incarcerating millions of people doesn't really change crime. It actually increases crime, because what you have is people who are disaffected, angry, unemployable, thrown out after their prison sentence to go through the same process over and over and over again. Now, I know this sounds like pontificating from, an urban area, but the reality is this type of shit has been tried before and it has failed miserably. And if Northern Territorians think by jailing more children in Dondale-like facilities that things are going to improve for them, it may in the short term, but in the long term, they're creating a noose for their own necks. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, those of you who are silly enough to actually watch the Trump convention and the Democratic convention would have noticed some interesting changes. New kids on the block. Now, I don't know if you know about influencers. They're people on the net who get lots of hits and they get paid. And then they get bought. And then they tell you they love this particular type of soft drink or they love that particular political party. There's a little bit of a Barney going on between traditional media outlets and influencers, because guess what? Who got some of the major perks at both these conventions? Virtual influencers. So we now see influencers are the latest kids on the not only the US electoral gravy train, but I assume our brothers and sisters in Australia, that's us, taking on the same line. Because you see, things have moved from the written word, well, on a piece of paper, to belief systems on the virtual world. And if influencers, it's a lovely name, are having so much influence on so many people, 3 million followers, 5 million followers, 10 million followers, well, they're easily incorporated into the electoral gravy train. Because, you see, influencers are not independent. They're like employees in the corporate-owned media. We're told they're independent, but they're only independent to a particular level. Because ultimately, whoever owns that particular news outlet decides the editorial content. And you know that if you stray once too often, that you'll be out of a job. And as jobs are shrinking in the legacy media, whether it's radio, television or the newspapers, we are seeing more and more people obtaining their news, in inverted commas, from influencers. So influencers are the new kid on the block. Keep an eye on them. The commercial sector has been well aware of the role that influencers can play in pushing a particular product. Remember poor old John Laws? I know he's still broadcasting somewhere in Sydney. Remember poor old John Laws? He used to kind of mention products in his program during his conversation and he'd get $1 for it or $2. Well, that's what an influencer is. They're nothing more than paid hacks for a particular political tendency or a particular commercial network. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Now, look, I'm a fan of the ABC. I read the captions under the news because that's occasional to see something new. But I've been disturbed. Well, a lot of people say you've been disturbed for a long time, Joe, but that's a different matter. I've been disturbed by the colonisation of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, especially the News and Current Affairs Division, how it's been colonised by the Murdoch media. Now, I know I speak about the government gelded ABC. Well, the government gelded ABC is no longer being gelded by the government, it's been gelded by the Murdoch media. Because after a consistent campaign against the editorial independence of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which has occurred over a number of decades, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation has finally thrown up its hands in horror and has fully been colonised by the Murdoch media. And if you think I'm joking, and you've got some time in your life to waste listening to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, they do have good music occasionally, well then I suggest you listen to the News and Current Affairs. See how many experts or journalists that are employed by the Murdoch media who are now used as commentators on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Instead of interviewing real people or public intellectuals or people from respected institutions regarding particular situation, we are seeing an increasing reliance on the Murdoch media employees. Whether it's a social setting, a cultural setting, a political setting, they're there constantly, day after day after day. So obviously the Murdoch media has resolved that there's no way that the government is going to privatise the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Even Mr Peter Dutton would have a bit of difficulty with that. But the way to neuter it is to have its journalists, its employees, to become the experts on particular issues on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Now, at least to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's credit, they will still tell you where a particular individual who's been interviewed, who their master or mistress is. But it's a good exercise for you to follow over the next week or two. If you've got the time, do it, see what happens. And you'd be amazed, as I've been, how the Murdoch media is now fully infiltrated, colonised the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And what we get at the end of the day on significant sections, not all, but significant sections of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, especially in the News and Current Affairs Department, is the same shit, the same crap, the same perverted analysis that we see in the Murdoch media, especially the Australian. Listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Gaza, well, the carnage continues, you know. They've rescued another hostages. Congratulations. The carnage continues. I saw a terrible missile barrage into the Ukraine. 7 people were killed. President Biden made a comment about how terrible it is. No problem. 100 civilians are killed in Gaza. Shrug of her shoulders. Why not kill 1,000, 10,000, 30,000, 40,000? Shrug of a shoulder. Unimaginable horrors. There is no infrastructure. The fact that the Israeli government was forced to allow 1 million doses of polio vaccine to go into Gaza because of polio, the beginning of a polio epidemic, highlights how difficult the situation is for people living in tents, no sewerage, bombing, raids, shortage of food, No problems with clean water. The world shrugs its shoulders, and the US of A continues to pump bombs into Israel. And when there was a little bit of fret that the Israeli people, because of their assassination policies through their government, may be the recipients of some missiles, well, what did we see the USA do? No, it didn't say this. It's naughty to kill people, especially the chief negotiator trying to negotiate, some type of truce in Gaza. No, they just send in another aircraft carrier, some more bombers, just to protect us. So while Big Brother, the US of A, continues to arm and support the Israeli government and the Israeli Defence Forces, the carnage that continues in Gaza, the carnage which is, I think, the worst thing we have seen in the 21st century on planet Earth, is just extraordinary. Just an extraordinary situation. It's like the Rohingya situation in Burma, where you've got the Chinese supporting the Burmese military against a popular revolution as they go about their ethnic cleansing. So, as I say, it's not a war, it's carnage. Last but not least, the CFMEU. Now, a lot of people think we live in a free society, obviously. People like me are able to broadcast because we live in a free society. Well, people like me are able to broadcast because we're totally irrelevant. The type of, sway we have in the community is negligible. I accept that. But again, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But we do have laws in this country, and we do have a parliamentary process that actually means that most people don't have the freedoms that they think they have. There's no protection for the individual under the Constitution for the arbitrary exercise of state power. That's why we see political dissidents currently in prison in this country. People like McBride. If I'm considered, or this program is considered to be a potential threat to the state, potential, this program can be shut down tomorrow. And if I open my mouth and complain, I can be in jail for up to 25 years. If I may have information which may assist the police, inadvertently have information which may assist the police in an ongoing terrorist investigation, I can be pulled off the streets, interrogated for 7 days, and if I refuse to answer questions, I can be in jail for up to 7 years. And on the 27th of March, we saw the ridiculous situation of when CFMEU members came out on the streets across the country, over 50,000 in Melbourne alone. They were threatened by the workplace ombudsman with prosecution and $10,000 fines a day because they were involved in unauthorised, illegal action. Because I don't think how many people realise that striking in this country is illegal outside an enterprise bargaining agreement, period. I don't think most people realise that we don't have a freedom of speech. The only freedom of speech we have in the Constitution is an implied freedom of speech during election periods, because you can't have an election without people opening their mouths, can you? Although you could have in Bangladesh. That's a different matter. Or in Putin's Russia. So who's next? I agree with that concept. Who's next? When Parliament can pass legislation to bypass the normal legal processes, which every other corporation which has had allegations of corruption levelled at it and even proven, every other organisation has been able to access due process, while in this country we see that due process removed and legislation passed to force the CFMEU into administration. I'm sure there are bad eggs in the CFMEU. There are bad eggs anyway. There's bad eggs in the carton of eggs I've currently got. That's part and parcel of life. You know that. But the thing is, there are due processes. And if you remove those due processes, it means that you could be next on the assembly line to have those due processes removed. You've been listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Those of you who are interested in pursuing these ideas, I encourage you to go to the website anarchistmedia.org or go to the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest website, pibci.net. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network on your local community radio station.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse, 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
.3CR is radical radio, and that means more than just alternative current affairs and political coverage.
We're radical because we're an independent media outlet, owned and operated by the community.
We're radical because we give communities the control of their own shows, with their own music, in their own languages.
We're radical because we provide a media platform for communities to build their own power to create social change.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call us on 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.